Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. US President Donald Trump has reignited his trade war. 92 countries have been hit with new tariff rates ranging from 10% to 40%. The new rates are set to take effect from the 7th of August. India is facing the highest tariffs in the region. The new rate for Bangladesh has been reduced from 35% earlier to 20%. Pakistan faces a 19% tariff and Afghanistan is the lowest with 15%. India is also staring at the highest tariff rate among developing economies in Asia. Vietnam faces 20%, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines all face a 19% tariff rate. President Trump has also vowed to penalize India for doing business with Russia, but has not clarified on the specifics. Sources tell us that the White House has been eyeing greater access for American products in India's dairy and agriculture markets. Indian government sources told CNBC-TV18 that they will never compromise on the interests of farmers. However, the government will continue to negotiate with the US due to their robust strategic partnership. In a press conference, External Affairs Ministry spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal has said India's partnership with the US has weathered several challenges and New Delhi is confident of continuing the relationship moving forward. He also pointed at the potential to grow the defense relationship and energy relationship even further.
India and the United States share a comprehensive global strategic partnership anchored in shared interests, democratic values, and robust people-to-people ties. This partnership has weathered several transitions and challenges. We remain focused on the substantive agenda that the two countries have committed to and are confident that the relationship will continue to move forward. We have strong ties with the United States. These ties have strengthened over the last several years and decades. There is potential for this partnership to grow further under the India-US Compact for the 21st century.
We're now joined by Philip Luck, Director of the Economics Programs at CSIS. Mr. Luck is also the former Deputy Chief Economist for the US State Department. We're also joined by Homayoun Falakshahi, Head of Crude Oil Analysis at Kpler, and Thomas Mathew, former bureaucrat who served as Deputy DG at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Mr. Mathew is also a security analyst. Thank you very much for being with us on the program. Philip Luck, if I can begin with you. You know, US has been investing in the India partnership for the last so many years as a buffer to China. What has gone wrong so seriously that Donald Trump has used this kind of language for the Indian government, saying that Russia and India are dead economies, they can go down together for all I care, then saying that we're going to penalize India with very harsh tariffs. Why would he use this kind of language for India? What's gone wrong? What's he so upset about? And what is the US really seeking from the trade deal?
It's a great question. I mean, I think I would certainly start by saying this seems to be frustration, not strategy. And we're seeing this replicated across many of other trading partners. I mean, if you think about critical minerals, Canada is going to be an incredibly important partner for our critical mineral supply chains. We are doing everything to disrupt those productive relationships. I think the exact same thing is true here with India. The last thing I would say is, you know, I think some of the problems that we're having, the administration clearly wants to be opening up markets for U.S. ag. A problem there is the reason they need markets for U.S. ag is because due to other trade tensions, other markets are shutting down. So exactly the sticking points that we have with India right now are in some sense self-created because of other challenges that we've created for ourselves.
Right. You know, just to speak to you about agriculture and dairy, you know, top government officials have briefed journalists here and they said that there can be no compromise on agriculture and dairy because almost 60 to 70% of our population is into farming. And these are farmers with very small land parcels. It's very difficult for India to give any concessions, and this would be a non-negotiable. And is agriculture and dairy really what US wants? Because on one hand, Donald Trump, Phil, says that India is a very small trading partner. We don't do too much trade with them. Is this about agriculture and dairy, or is it about bigger oil and defense contracts?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, it certainly is the case that people have indicated to the president, or they've gotten into his ear and said that these barriers are things that have to come down. But to your point, I don't think there's a proper appreciation for the fact that these are non-negotiable. These are things that are incredibly difficult to do, and the concessions that we would have to make, which of course we're not willing to, would have to be enormous to sort of offset the implications for the Indian economy. To your point, there are areas of compromise. I mean, or rather mutual benefit, whether it be through continuing to increase our defense cooperation or oil and gas and other areas. The other area I would say, of course, I do think even though they didn't put a tariff on India for its imports of oil above the price cap from Russia, I do think if there was some ability to make movement there, that could really help.
Right. Let me go across to Homayoun Falakshahi on that question. Homayoun, we are telling the United States that we have a diversified crude partnership. Our energy partnership with the US is strong. We are going to buy $25 billion worth of oil and gas from the US this year. But we have to keep in mind geopolitics and market demand and market conditions. To what extent are you seeing India's import of Russian energy go down? Do you significantly see India's energy imports from US going up?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me. I think, to an extent, imports from from Russia into India have been relatively stable year on year. So, as you know, India emerged as one of the largest buyers of Russian crude after the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the imports went up from 30,000 barrels per day back in 2021 to 1.8 million barrels per day. So far this year, we're still at these levels. We're slightly under on a year-on-year basis. We're only down by about 50,000 barrels per day. But it's true that in July, we have seen a big drop in imports into India of Russian crude. But it's also down from a very high level back in June. So in June, we saw more than 2 million barrels per day of imports, actually. And there's been a 500,000 barrels per day drop in July. This could be the beginning of something, as you mentioned that India could shift some of its crude diet more towards, let's say, countries like the Middle East or even the US as well. So it's true that we've seen an increase in oil imports from the US, but in terms of volumes and the magnitude of the shifts, it's far from being sufficient, I would say, in the Indian market. So, we have seen a drop of 500 KBD, 500,000 barrels per day from Russia. And on the other side, we have seen an increase of 100,000 barrels per day from the US. And looking forward, given the US has a very diversified export market, the US cannot really replace Russia in the Indian market. We could see imports from the US go to as high, I would say, as 300,000 barrels per day, which is another 100,000 barrels per day on top of what is currently being achieved. But it's hard to see it go a lot higher, considering all the different characteristics of US crude as well, which is quite different in terms of quality compared to Russian crude.
That brings me to my next question. To what extent have you seen a growth, a jump in India's import of US crude, US LNG since February this year, and logistically speaking, and complementarities in crude refineries, price-wise, can US actually replace Russian crude, and will India be able to stop buying Russian crude altogether?
So the answer to your very last question really depends on the extent of the U.S. action against Russia here. Whether it's going to be secondary sanctions being imposed, whether it's secondary tariffs, it makes a difference. Or even, as we think at Kpler, we believe that this is mainly a negotiating tactic from the Trump administration, and at the end of the day, there will be an agreement to continue import oil from Russia to an extent. Secondary sanctions, of course, I think this is the kind of bazooka option from the Trump administration. It would mean that all Indian refiners would suddenly need to stop imports from Russia. Secondary tariffs, I think it's still quite debatable, and we could still see some imports from Russia. Looking at the imports from the US, we have seen, again, an increase since the beginning of the year. And if you compare, for example, with 2024 and 2023, there has been an increase of about 100,000 barrels per day in the past 2 years to about 200,000 barrels per day. on average so far this year. Actually, the past 2-3 months, we have been closer to 270,000 barrels per day from the US. But again, if you look at this magnitude, it's far from being able to replace Russian crude in the Indian market, which is 6 times higher in terms of volumes. The fact that the US, needs to export to different markets as well, mean that it cannot be replacing Russia on its own in the Indian market. However, India can also turn to the Middle East and to West Africa, for example. We have seen the spread between Brent and Dubai come down. So it means that crude from the likes of West Africa and Brazil are becoming more attractive to Indian buyers. But I think it would still be a problem because the Russian share in the Indian market is still at 37%. And so that's a huge chunk to replace, and it will come at high cost if it has to be.
Right. Let me go across to Mr. Thomas Mathew. Mr. Thomas Mathew, as someone who has watched India-US relations for a long time, is there still room for some creative negotiations and diplomacy? How do you find a way around your red lines? You've got a US president saying that you have to give me unprecedented access or I'm going to hit you with secondary tariffs, and those could come as early as the next 10 days. If the Russia-Ukraine talks were to fail, there could be more penalties on India. What options does India have?
Yeah, Parikshit, firstly, thank you for having me on this talk. Now, let me tell you, India is in a slightly precarious position here. You have Trump, who is very unrestrained in both his actions and talk, and he will walk his talk. If you see what has happened to UK, you should understand the Anglo-Saxon country has always been the closest to the United States. And even with regard to UK, he has negotiated a very tough deal and got several concessions from UK. And he has reduced the tariffs to 10%. Another strategic partner like Japan, he has imposed 15%, and EU, the largest trading bloc, also 15%. Now, can India defy Trump? My answer is no, India cannot. Now, if India were to be penalized for importing Russian oil, it would actually impact India's economy substantially. We need to accept that the US is the giant in the world market. It's about 26% of the world GDP. And plus India's exports to US and India's trade with the US is about 18 to 20% of its total trade. So India cannot do without the US. But at the same time, I think India will have to take a principled stand and negotiate very carefully, pampering to, if I may say, Mr. Trump's ego. The whole shift in Trump's strategy with regard to Russia, I'm told, happened because Melania Trump's influence on Trump, and there's been a sudden shift saying that the Russian president, who was considered to be very savvy, very smart by Trump, has suddenly become his nemesis. Now, if he's going to take a tough stance with regard to Russia, you need to understand that we are importing, as Mr. Homayoun said, we are importing close to 37 to 40% of our needs from Russia. And that's about $50 billion. Can you change overnight? You cannot. You will probably be able to spread your intake to other countries over a period of time. But if Trump takes a tough stance, you will be compelled to enter into some kind of negotiated settlement. If EU has been compelled, if Japan has been compelled, if UK, the closest ally of the US, has been compelled, then I think India has no choice. India will have to negotiate very subtly with the US administration. Although the stance of Trump administration, according to me, is completely irrational from many points of view.
Right. Mr. Mathew, I want to speak to you about the defense partnership because that's the other irritant in talks. I'm going to take a break, but I'll request all our guests to stay with us. We'll be right back.